Trump's people, Trump's White House, is behaving as if they have something to hide. They're behaving like the Nixon White House before Watergate.
There's an issue of competence here. This may be his first time in a political rodeo, but this is not his first time in a rodeo. It's not the first time that he's had to worry about legal implications of his words or his actions.
Donald Trump is caught in the middle of a Category 5 shitstorm. Yep. Sorry for the language, but it's the best way to say it. And it's not like in the eye of a hurricane where it's calm. It's more like in the vector of a tornado where there's cars and like church pews flying around, that kind of storm. It started with the bizarre timing of the James Comey firing, followed by some cryptic tweets by the president suggesting he may have recorded the conversations that he had with James Comey. Followed next by the leak of confidential information that his surrogates initially denied that he had done to the Russian ambassador. Trump then later sort of undercut his own advisors by acknowledging he had done them, but saying there was nothing wrong with leaking this information. And finally, you've got the most damning, potentially, incident that's occurred, which is James Comey's memos that he had written to the file back in February after a meeting with the president, where he says that the president, in sum and substance, intimidated him, influenced him, tried to coerce him out of continuing his investigation into Michael Flynn, Trump's
former security advisor,
a security advisor who was then later fired for having been potentially subjected to influence by the Russians. So a lot's going on. But you got to remember, throughout the campaign and since, Donald Trump has been knocked down and left for dead before and has come roaring back. Obviously, he won the presidency, notwithstanding having having all these revelations come out about him. So is this a temporary hiccup for a strong but unorthodox leader, or is it the beginning of the end for a corrupt political neophyte? We're going to have to wait and see. And obviously, this has all raised the specter, the recordings, the midnight firings of old Richard Nixon. He did similar sorts of things, and it got us thinking about the historical context in which we're in. So we're going to be joined by two of really the most decorated historians of our time who are going to come in and talk to us about these very issues, the relationship between Donald Trump's actions and those of Richard Nixon's, the parallels or the lack thereof. I'm Jason Beckerman.
And I'm Derek Kaufman.
And this is Behind the Bar.
So, Jason, before we dive into all this with our Nixon experts, let's get one thing out of the way. It is not illegal for Donald Trump to be taping conversations in the White House. It may be unseemly, it may have political consequences, but in the District of Columbia, we have a one-party consent state. And what that means is the only person who has to consent to a recording is the party who is recording it. That's it. You don't have to ask the person you're recording. You can just record away. There's no crime committed. Several states, including California, are two-party consent states where you got to announce to the other person, hey, do you mind if I record you? That's why when you call certain hotlines, you often hear them say, do you mind if we record the conversation?
And this has been really the subject of a lot of questions that we've received at TMZ and at Behind the Bar about what is the legality of this, because it seems so intuitive that in order for you to be recorded, you must know that you're being recorded. But that's definitely not the case. As a matter of fact, in the vast majority of states, it's not the case. A minority of states are two-party consent states. Most are one-party consent, and some are zero-party consent, which is mean a third person to the conversation can record it without the knowledge of either of the participants to the conversation, and that's legal.
Right.
The District of Columbia, as you said, a one-party consent state. Donald Trump knew, if it happened, knew he was recording. That's all it takes.
So that's the legality issue. Now let's talk about the historical tradition a little bit, because when you talk about tapes, where does your mind go? You talk about White House recordings, everyone's mind goes to Richard Nixon. You'd think about the 18 minutes that were deleted by Rosemary Woods, his personal secretary. You think about the Watergate scandal. It actually goes back way further. And do you think it started with a Republican or a Democrat, Jason?
Oh, I think it started with a Republican, Richard Nixon.
Not at all. That started with FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and actually emanated from a combative relationship with the press. There was a quote in one of the papers at the time in 1939 when we were on the brink of getting involved in Hitler's uprising, where someone quoted him as saying,
"It's bad to say that we got involved in Hitler's uprising." I mean,
is that
get involved in
diminishing our role?
Well, I think it's putting us on the wrong side of history to get involved in the uprising.
Oh, that's true.
But please proceed.
This is true. So someone portrayed FDR's position toward the emerging threat of Germany as the American frontier on the Rhine, and everyone interpreted this as saying, "Listen, we're isolationists. We should maybe stay put and worry about our domestic affairs. We just got out of the Great Depression." And he said that quote actually misrepresented what he was trying to say, and he didn't like that it was out there. So he devised a way to secretly record his press conferences. He said, I want a record for posterity. I don't want the press running with quotes that misrepresent what I said.
Press conferences, obviously, in the day were not televised. They were not recorded by the media. Instead, the media members would sit there with pen and pencil and take down the presumably verbatim quotes from the president and then report them accurately. And he was upset this wasn't happening.
That's exactly right. So FDR, like Nixon and other presidents, wanted to be in control of his message. He had those fireside chats, which were well-produced sort of sermons to America. And so what he did is he set up a large recorder with a microphone hidden in a lamp on his desk, and he said, let's record. There was a long wire. It was obviously not as sophisticated as the technology got, and that was the dawn of recordings in the White House. There's recordings from Truman administration. There's the Eisenhower administration. JFK actually has several hours.
LBJ famously,
and he was one of those crass Texans. So you can look up online. There's tons of recordings of him being sort of less poised than you would expect a president to be. But so all of these recordings in the initial, before there was the Presidential Records Act, they actually owned the recordings. But now
the presidents did individually, they own the recordings.
That's right. The presidents could take them for their own personal library, their own collection to document their administration. Now they're actually owned by the people. There's a Presidential Records Act, so all of these recordings that Nixon has are publicly available. They're part of the public record. So it actually has this long history. And after Nixon, it sort of became less used. You can say each administration can come in and say whether they want things to be recorded after his administration, and obviously with Watergate, people didn't use it as much.
In the wake of everything we're going through as a country and the Trump administration is going through, the surreptitious tape recordings, the suspect firings of government officials and the like, the inclination, Derek, is to draw parallels between obviously the administration of Richard Nixon and the administration of Donald Trump. And those parallels, I think, extend not just to the president's actions, but also to the men themselves.
Well, I see the essential parallel, one of temperament. Both of them rage. Both of them see themselves as being victims. They won the game of, if you think about the game of life, I mean, they're winners. They both entered the Oval Office. They have the most powerful position in the world. And yet they seem to feel that they're victims, and that there are enemies out there that are seeking to deprive them or deny them of what is their just deserts, if you will.
That's Tim Naftali. He's the former director of the Nixon Presidential Library and professor of, among many other things, presidential history at New York University.
But I'd like to focus on what I perceive to be the actual dissimilarities between the two men. Richard Nixon has this reputation as one of the most calculating, maybe if you're not a fan, sort of Machiavellian impulses. I don't see Donald Trump as nearly as impressive. Could this cut in his favor in sort of batting this stuff back, that he's an outsider, not such an insider as Richard Nixon was, so that he's not actually a puppeteer of a grand cover-up, but actually just someone who's sort of feeling his way out and couldn't really form the criminal intent necessary to be impeached?
You have to ask a question, which is that Donald Trump has worked with lawyers all his professional life. How is it not? How hasn't any of this rubbed off on him? Why is he so careless with his use of words? Why would he approach the head of a law enforcement agency and even imply a willingness to interfere in an ongoing investigation? I mean, after all the years in New York, he hasn't learned that he should be careful about what he says. So some of that argument, yes, he's an outsider, yeah, that works, but some of it doesn't.
Right.
There's an issue of competence here. This may be his first time in a political rodeo, but this is not his first time in a rodeo. It's not the first time that he's had to worry about legal implications of his words or his actions.
So this opinion that's expressed by Professor Naftali, that Donald Trump may be more sophisticated, or at least should be more sophisticated than maybe we give him credit for, is something that is shared by other historians. Here's John Farrell, Nixon's biographer, the author of Nixon, A Life, talking about this very same issue.
Well, there's two possibilities when you look at Donald Trump's personality. One is that this is all just Trump being Trump. He's just this baby Huey who is unsophisticated in the ways of Washington, and he's spouting things out that other politicians, career politicians, would know to stay away from. And it's even somewhat charming that we have this amateur in the White House who can just be himself. But the flip side of that is that Donald Trump is a man in his eighth decade who has climbed the very slippery media pole in New York City and the world of casinos and development. This is no neophyte, and it's quite possible that this sort of aw shucks Trumpian bluster. This is his thing. This is the way that Nixon was cunning in his way. This is the way that Trump is cunning his own way, so that he says things and then they're brought up, and he sort of shrugs and waves his hand in the air and says, "Oh, that was locker room talk," and everybody goes, "Oh, Don, he's the Donald."
So there's this temptation to see Trump as a political neophyte, but I actually think that does him a bit of a disservice. Remember, Trump is a guy who's sophisticatedly navigated the New York business scene for years. He became a billionaire, and just recently he pulled off one of the largest electoral upsets in history, Jason.
Yeah, and Farrell and Natali, both in their writings and what they said here, sort of focus quite a bit on this quickness to rage, this impulsiveness that Donald Trump has, whether it be the firing of James Comey or his lashing out at the press. But really, that's just sort of the tip of the Donald Trump iceberg. We had this event earlier this week where he was accused of leaking information, confidential, highly classified information to the Russian ambassador that could compromise, arguably, the Democrats say, and Trump denies this wholeheartedly, as do the Israelis, as have the Russians come out and denied this as well, that compromises not only our security, but also our existing relationship with key allies. How much stock do you put in that? How much weight do you put in the fact that these leaks could in fact be detrimental to the counterterrorism effort?
Well, I would really... the president has the authority to share classified information with foreign governments.
Yep.
What Donald Trump did, which was highly questionable and probably a big mistake, was to share information from another country with a third party. The U.S. has very extensive intelligence sharing relationships with many countries around the world, and those are based on trust. And they're based on the assumption that you're not going to share that information without the prior approval of the country that gave it to you. That's the part of the story that's so troubling. Whether this imperils the source or not, I mean, that would be troubling too, but I don't know enough about exactly what was shared. I think, though, that there's reason enough to be concerned and disappointed in the president simply because he shared another country's secret information. That's not up to him to do. He can share his own. He can share our government's information, but he can't share somebody else's without their approval.
So in the face of everything, Derek, Donald Trump really took a defiant stand. For the first time, he spoke out about many of these allegations during a commencement address at the Coast Guard Academy. And he took a really defiant stage and stated that he is the most unfairly treated politician in world history. A remarkable statement.
It really is. I mean, I think Slate put this best. They had a headline that said, in effect, that Donald Trump calls himself the most unfairly treated president in history, ignores everyone who was murdered, which I thought just put such a fine point on it.
Right. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, but despite him digging in his heels here, where does this leave the president? Obviously, the appointment of Robert Mueller as special counsel to conduct a wide-ranging investigation into Trump's dealings with Russia during the campaign brings the possibility of impeachment really into focus.
The allegations are now approaching Watergate-type allegations. If you look at the big difference is that Richard Nixon had a very hostile Democratic Congress, and Donald Trump has a somewhat compliant Republican Congress. And if you really go down the road and think that this thing plays all the way out, you need 67 votes in the United States Senate to convict, which is why Bill Clinton got off, even though he was impeached by the House of Representatives in 1996. That's a big nut.
But Tim Natali, even if the president is found to have done something wrong, and that's obviously a big if, we've got a long way to go. Impeachment is obviously a long political process. In Nixon's case, the Watergate break-in took place in June of 1972, but he didn't resign, and had he not resigned, it could have gone on for years longer, honestly, throughout his presidency, probably. He didn't resign until August of 1974, well over 2 years later. Do you really see impeachment as a plausible scenario in the case of Donald Trump?
I'm a historian. I'm terrible at making predictions. I got the 2016 election wrong.
I think we all did.
Let me tell you, but I'm not ducking this, okay?
Okay.
Let me tell you what you're looking for. What you're looking for over the next few weeks or months, one is first of all, what kinds of records did Comey keep? Two, does he testify under oath and confirm? I think he would, but confirm these records, and do we see them? Then it's Comey versus the president. How does Donald Trump react? Does he overreact? Does he start making more mistakes? Do we see people resigning from the White House? And as his poll numbers, if his poll numbers continue to drop, do we see members of Congress who are concerned about 2018 starting to really distance themselves from him and thus lead to a discussion of perhaps this is not the right job for this man? That's what we're looking for.
So, Derek, we have the historical context for all of this. We know what the precedents are, but let's drill down on the memos here, on the allegation that Donald Trump tried to influence James Comey into dropping the investigation against Flynn. All of the talks about obstruction of justice. What does the law tell us? Where are we really? Is this obstruction of justice that he can be prosecuted for and potentially impeached for, or much ado about nothing?
So let's start with the law. So there's a statute that is directly on point for obstruction of justice. It's 18 U.S.C. 1505, and it states in relevant part that there's a crime if you, quote, corruptly or by threats of force or by any threatening letter or communication influence, obstruct, or impede or endeavor to influence, obstruct, or impede an open investigation.
Right.
Now, we can quibble over sort of the semantics here, but a superior, which Trump was to Comey, suggesting that an investigation be dropped, you could see that as influence, right, Jason, or at least endeavoring to push the investigation in a certain manner.
Here's the thing, and there's a great difficulty with prosecuting obstruction of justice claims, and that is you have to get into the head of the person who made the comment. Because remember, it's important. The most important word in that statute is corruptly endeavors, or corruptly intimidates, or corruptly suggests, or corruptly influences. To be corrupt, it suggests a mental state of the person speaking. And without knowing what the mental state of the president was there, was he just talking out loud? How much can you divine, and can you divine it beyond a reasonable doubt that he did it with the intent to corrupt the investigation into this person, therefore did it corruptly? But I think, so that's
and it's hard with Trump. Trump is a loose, bloviating, blustery type figure. He could just be talking out loud, or he could be trying to abuse his power. We don't really know with him. He does both in different contexts, right?
He sure does. But, here we're sort of past the legal definition of obstruction of justice. We're into the political one, right? Because we all know that a president can be impeached, and there's no judicial review on that. We always look at this high crimes and misdemeanors. Has a high crime been committed? Has a misdemeanor been committed? That's up to interpretation. And really, who's to interpret that? The members of the House of Representatives and the members of the Senate, ultimately, are the ones that will ultimately decide whether or not he committed this, not a judge who has to look at the letter of the statute.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Even though we call it conviction by the conviction, there's no court proceeding at all with impeachment.
Right.
It takes place solely between the houses of Congress, and the conviction arm of it is run like a trial, but it's done by politicians, which is very different than judges.
It is a totally political calculation of whether or not enough members of the House and enough members of the Senate want to declare this to be a high crime or a misdemeanor, and a misdemeanor is pretty low crime, right?
Right.
And whether or not they choose to impeach and then convict him of the charges of obstruction of justice.
And as you said, if you're upset about the outcome, there's nowhere you can look. I know Trump sort of has announced some contempt for our judges, so-called judges and things like that. He says that
irrelevant to this
but
procedure.
There's nowhere to look. After you're impeached, it's over.
Of course, we're getting ahead of ourselves with all this, right? The facts are new. The case is new. The revelation that James Comey had written these memos and that they're now coming to light is all new. And we're going to have to really wait and see where this all leads us.
Yeah, we're in the realm of speculation here. And remember, both houses of Congress are controlled by Republicans at this point. So it would take a lot to impeach a president.
John Farrell pointed out, this is far from a done deal that anything's going to happen at all to this president.
What's that sound, Jason?
Mail time.
Mail time. Remember to write in your questions and comments to behindthebar@tmz.com. What are you laughing at?
Your presentation voice. Go ahead.
You both. All right, first one up is from Brian, commenting on last week's Hernandez debate. I agree that the law should be followed regardless of the circumstances of an individual case. But don't you think the law should be changed so that suicide is excluded from the law that states that he should have the murder charge erased because he died during an appeal?
Oh, Brian, you've gotten into a fierce debate between Derek and me. Derek thinks the law should be changed. People who die of suicide should not be able to take advantage of this law.
I do, and I think Jason disagrees. My point would be that if you decide to truncate your appeal by killing yourself, you've actually made the decision to end it, which I think is enough to allow the conviction to stand.
Yeah, I know how that sounds good and it makes intuitive sense, but we still have to uphold our system of justice. And our system of justice says that not only do you have a right to a jury by your peers, but you also have a right to appeal the decision, the verdict of that jury, and have a court determine whether or not it was based on the correct evidence. Somebody could, so you can imagine a situation where somebody is wrongly convicted of a crime, and they're so despondent over the wrongful conviction by that crime, and the unlikelihood that you can prevail on appeal, and the many, many years it would take, and the lack of funds to do it, and they would say, you know what, I'm going to kill myself because I'm so despondent, and that person has been wronged. And our system does not allow convictions of wronged people. We try not to, at least.
Yep.
All right, next one up is from Adam. My question is about the reckless disregard standard for libel against a public figure. For example, last week the New York Times claimed former FBI Director James Comey was seeking more resources for investigation into Trump-Russia links before he was fired. This was refuted by the new acting head of the FBI, among others, but was never retracted and continues to be taken as fact. It seems like any media claim, if plausible, is automatically protected speech. But doesn't that mean that the media can fully make up sources or collude to advance their own interests and continually hide behind journalistic privileges if they were maliciously inclined?
I think there's a big step there when you're making up sources. When you are inventing from whole cloth, I think you're doing something maybe even maliciously. It's not even reckless disregard at that point. But when you get things wrong, the media has to have the latitude to be wrong and still report things, because otherwise you'll chill these outlets and you won't get enough information at all. And I think that's what's really animating the policy.
Yeah, if journalists had to be sure of the accuracy of their story to a metaphysical certainty or risk being sued for millions of dollars, you wouldn't get any publication of anything.
They'd never hit print.
Right. Well, or post.
Or post.
That's right. But and also, let's not overstate the protection that the media organizations have. I mean, if to Derek's point, if you are truly making things up, that's malicious. If you're colluding with other entities, that's malicious. The way it works in practice is that somebody will sue a media entity for libel. The person suing them has the burden of proof to put up a sufficient amount of evidence to show that there is a false statement, that it may have been libelous, that it may have been malicious, and then at some point the burden of proof shifts to the defending entity, the newspaper or the journalist, whatever it might be, and that person's going to have to come forward with some sort of evidence. So they can't simply hide behind the source privileges and other privileges to avoid ever having to put forward a defense and just relying on the plaintiff's inability to prove beyond any doubt. You know, at some point the media is going to have to defend themselves with evidence. So it's not that great of a privilege as maybe suggested.
And that is it for Mail Time.
Thanks very much, everybody. We will see you again with another riveting episode of Behind the Bar next week.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for watching. If you want more nerdy deep dives into the legal side of celebrity news, hit our subscribe button right here.
And check out our previous episode over here.